Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm going to switch to Spanish for just a few minutes to explain to our Spanish audience how to get into the channel where they could hear the conference in Spanish if they wish. Hola, gracias por estar aquí esta tarde. Si desea escuchar esta conferencia en español, nuestra intérprete, Eva, está lista para traducirla. Para ir al canal en español, ubique un icono en el lado inferior derecho de su barra de menú. Es un icono de un globo terráqueo con las palabras Interpretation. Haga clic en el globo terráqueo, seleccione español y haga clic Mute Original Audio para silenciar el audio en inglés. Está preparado y solo escucharás a Eva. Después del panel de discusión, responderemos preguntas. Si tienen alguna aún, escribe su pregunta al Q&A. Eva traducirá vuestra pregunta al inglés. So hi, my name is Erica Aitken. I'm with Reimagine Santa Cruz. Thank you for being here today to hear and take part in our most important question today: is affordable housing possible? Reimagine came to light this summer for several reasons. One was to supplement the campaigns of several Santa Cruz City Council candidates. We had reacted to the passage of the mixed-use project downtown. We not only opposed that construction of the 6-story parking garage where a farmer market is, but we were dismayed by how this project was passed. We're aware that we do not understand enough about what is planned for our future, and we want not only to be informed, but we want to take part in our future. We would like Reimagine to be a channel of communication around issues such as housing, and plan to continue making videos, write articles, and organize events such as these. Our format today and tomorrow is such. We're going to begin with a keynote presentation and follow with a panel discussion. Our panelists are all experts in what touches affordable housing, either as government officials, policy shapers, or advocates. After the discussion, we'll have a question and answer time, hopefully 30 to 35 minutes. And we'd like you to write your questions in the Q&A field, and we'll be able to get them there. Please welcome Daniel Herrigues. He is with Strong Towns, an organization committed to sustainable and community-driven development. Daniel, the floor is yours. Please share your screen.
I will do that. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the chance to speak to you tonight. I also want to say I lived out in the Bay Area years ago. I did my undergrad at Stanford, and you have a beautiful community. I loved going down to Santa Cruz on the weekends. I'd hop the bus from Diridon Station, and just a great place. So I'm going to share my slides here and then full screen that window. And hang on as I attempt to find my. All right, are you seeing my slides in full screen?
Yes.
Did that work? Okay. So I've been asked to address the theme of the conference here, is affordable housing possible? And I think the tone of my presentation is going to be a little bit unlike the real technical expertise that you're going to get in the panel discussion. I don't have the depth of local knowledge that the other panelists have. And I'm choosing to give you something instead that hopefully will be really good food for thought and sort of a zoomed out attempt to address that question that can hopefully provide a lens that then informs the really specific local discussions that you all have. As Erica said, I am with Strong Towns. We are a national nonprofit that supports a model of development that allows America's cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. We take our inspiration from traditional forms of urban development found all over the world prior to the modern era, time-tested rules of urban design that have endured for thousands of years. And we believe that a resilient city is one that is responsive to bottom-up feedback and responsive to community needs and puts those things first. And housing issues may feel separate from that question of our overall model of development, But I'm going to argue that it's not, that the way we build our cities and towns is at the core of why we are in what feels like a perpetual housing crisis. So I'll start there, and then I'm going to dig into what it looks like to make housing affordable. And then we're going to talk about the need to distinguish two kinds of policies. There are those which provide immediate help to people right now, a Band-Aid of sorts, and there are those which start to really unwind the systemic causes of this problem. So who builds housing? Historically, the answer to that was just about everyone. Cities prior to the past century were really co-creations of their residents out of necessity. And there wasn't a professional class of developers like you see today. And there weren't nearly as many bureaucracies around planning and development and growth. And so when you look at how a place like this, which is San Francisco in 1851, over the course of a century and a half can become this, the answer is through the decentralized and mostly uncoordinated actions of many, many hands over many years. In that traditional model of development, as a place prospers, as it succeeds, it becomes wealthier over time. As more people move to a place, that place makes room. And it makes room by growing out, but it also makes room by evolving. The existing neighborhoods grow up, they become a little bit denser, people modify the existing buildings or replace them. And all of this happens in a very chaotic, very organic sort of way. And you can see that with America's 19th century boomtowns. First Cincinnati, and then St. Louis, and then Chicago were all on the frontier at one point. They were all places that huge numbers of people migrated into in very short amounts of time. And their growth was chaotic, but it allowed for very, very rapid growth as well. Chicago added 1 million people from being a tiny town on the prairie in only 40 years, from 1850 to 1890. In the next 40 years, it would add another 2 million. And these are growth rates that are unheard of today, but they produced a lot of America's most beloved places. Neighborhoods like this, these New York brownstones, which when they were first marketed in the early 20th century were actually pitched as a form of affordable luxury, believe it or not. One of those words might still apply today and the other one less and less. Or Boston triple deckers. These were not built by large scale corporate developers. These were largely built by small time investors, carpenters with some time on their hands, factory owners, mill owners looking for housing for their employees. And so the city evolved as a co-creation of its residents by many, many hands. And this model was in some ways a very small d democratic way of meeting community needs. You know, the triple decker was such an enduring model in New England because it was a stepping stone into the middle class. A family could easily own one of these, live in one of the units, and rent out the other two. And these kinds of arrangements used to be extremely common, and you see the legacy of them in almost any city built before World War II, roughly. Post-World War II, America transitioned very rapidly to a very different model, a model which we at Strong Towns call America's suburban experiment. And it was a model really predicated on a mass production approach to growth, a mass production approach to housing. Epitomized by Levittown. William Levitt and Sons built a series of entire suburban communities in the 1950s from the ground up on almost an assembly line production model. A house could be built in one day according to a standard template, and you were buying a home like you'd buy a car. And the influence of that model extends beyond just suburban subdivisions. You also see it now in urban development. You see standardized business models, and they're standardized largely because they can predictably get financing at low rates. They're repeatable, they're predictable, you can do mass sourcing of materials. And we have a whole planning system that has evolved around this standardization. Most cities' zoning codes are copy pasted. And so the financing is a huge driver of what you might think of as cookie cutter development, or what I've heard you referred as buildings designed by accountants. And this has spurred a backlash, of course, the ever-present complaint, why do all new apartment buildings look the same? And the answer is the financing. Housing is now a Wall Street product. And in fact, the housing market in There's a truism, I don't know who said it originally, but the housing market is the economy, as Americans learned in a really harsh way in 2007 and 2008. It's a huge driver of the national economy, and so it answers to Wall Street's imperatives. This has created a dynamic where if you just think about the interests involved in this system, there are a whole bunch of institutions now that have ever rising housing costs kind of in their interests, at stake for them, from governments reliant on a source of revenue to the development industry, the land, the real estate industry, but also existing homeowners end up with a stake in this system. They're in the list on the left because in almost every city in America, the biggest land speculators are the existing homeowners. And in California in particular, there are millions of people who are on paper millionaires because of the equity they have in their homes. Who doesn't benefit from high house prices? There are really only two groups. There are lower income people, moderate income people, and there are renters. Renters stand to lose when the price of a home goes up. The owner stands to gain. And so we've got this system where every institutional incentive is really stacked against the goal of abundant, affordable housing. But we also have a system where we've taken something that was complex and adaptive and replaced it with something that is complex and over-optimized and efficient in a narrow sense. Think about the difference between a rainforest and a cornfield. The rainforest is a complex system. It has a huge amount of biodiversity. It has a huge amount of different interactions. And it has a bunch of emergent properties as a result. And traditional cities are like that complex system in that they respond to a huge number of local needs in a hyper-local way by people taking uncoordinated action to meet them. What we've done by standardizing and siloing and professionalizing almost every aspect of how we build housing and how we grow our cities is we've turned it into something more like a cornfield that is highly efficient, highly optimized, but ultimately fragile. A blight could wipe this out. A bad rain year, a bad drought year could wipe this out. The traditional development pattern is complex and adaptive and organic, like this Italian hill town you can see here. The suburban experiment development pattern is hyper-efficient, over-optimized, and fragile. Instead of a diverse, eclectic mix of types of buildings, types of homes, we now have monocultural neighborhoods with only one type of home. Instead of short feedback loops where you have a problem and you get that in the hands of someone who can meet it, we have distant and slow feedback loops. You look at the way the market overbuilt prior to the 2007 crash and then overcorrected. Instead of cities created by many hands, we have cities created by a small number of large-scale corporate developers. And instead of cities that evolve and change and flex, we have cities, neighborhoods, whole places that are built to a finished state and then expected to never change. And that's created some deep dysfunction because we've drastically limited the ability of our cities to adapt and evolve incrementally in response to change. Dysfunction in a complex system, you may not be able to trace all the causes and effects, but you can see the evidence of it. And the evidence in America is really clear. These are national statistics, but median new home prices versus median household income has gone up and up and up. The ratio of the cost of housing to the ability of the people who need it to pay for it. The Case-Shiller Index is another measure of that. You can see the 2007 boom and bust on this, but you can also see the current so-called recovery. Last time it was a bubble. This time, we don't know. They're not calling it a bubble, but you can see that the system is correcting and overcorrecting. Imagine a car skidding on ice one way and then the other. That is a system that is out of whack. So what is the goal? That is the big picture strong towns analysis that sort of permeates our vision of what needs to change with regard to growth and development in North America. To narrow in on the goal of this conference, on the topic at hand here, I think there are two ways we could think about our goal if we're going to ask, is affordable housing possible? And one way is, how do we create affordable housing? But the other question we could ask is, how do we make housing broadly affordable? And those are not the same question. And they don't have remotely the same solutions. The places where housing is broadly affordable aren't necessarily the places that are better at building affordable housing. And that's especially true if you're talking about what people in the nonprofit affordable housing industry call capital A affordable housing, that is subsidized housing, that is deed restricted, income restricted, to make it available to people who need it. Creating that isn't necessarily the core of the bigger systemic problem, but I think it's a necessary band-aid. So we will also talk about, and I can see that the panel discussion is going to feature some really great nitty-gritty, locally focused discussion on how do we deal with the urgent problem in front of us right now, which is housing people who need housing. The strong towns analysis is a little different, which means I may drive you all nuts with this presentation, but hopefully I provide some useful food for thought, because we talk about how do you get to a system that can produce solutions. What determines the cost of a home? That's really two questions. What determines the cost of purchasing a home versus what determines the cost of building a home? The market price of existing housing versus the cost of construction. It's worth disentangling those things from each other. There's a common refrain that you'll hear that developers are only building luxury housing. And it's often an exasperated refrain. You know what? This isn't what our community needs. Why do they keep putting up luxury housing? And I don't think it's because developers are inherently greedier or more sociopathic or whatnot than other people. I think it's because they're business people. They're responding to incentives. They're trying to make money. And if you want to understand housing development, you have to understand how the developer thinks. Just a little side note here, the word luxury in the development world is a marketing term. It is certainly true that most of the new housing being produced in Northern California, or a lot of places for that matter, is high end and is unaffordable to most of the population. That's true. This, however, I snapped this photo near me in Sarasota, Florida, and I had to laugh because this is a cheap, renovation of an old 1975 apartment complex, and they're building it as new luxury condos. You can really apply that term to anything, and the real estate industry does. And actually, one of the reasons that a lot of new housing has luxury finishes, quote unquote, things like nice granite countertops, high-end appliances. One of the reasons for that is that those things are only a tiny fraction of the development cost, and there's almost no reason not to do it because they don't make very much of a percentage difference in the total cost of building that home or that unit. Development cost comes down to a few categories. If you're going to build a building with homes in it, you have to buy the land, you have to build the building. I put an asterisk there because that includes all your soft costs, things like hiring an architect, an engineer, a legal team, as well as the hard costs of hiring your construction workers, your plumber, your electrician. And then you have to finance that development because very few developers have the cash on hand to erect an apartment building, even a home. These things are all paid for with debt, and there's interest on that debt. And finally, a for-profit developer is going to require a little bit of return on investment on the top. So that's really the 4-ingredient formula to the development costs. And if you want to deal with that cost, you start digging into these aspects and where is the cost inflation coming from and what can we do about each part of that equation? Ultimately, the developer wants to know, does it pencil? If I build this and then I sell it for a profit or rent it out for a profit, can I pay off my construction loan and can I make a little bit of profit? That's their question. The cost of on the market of an existing home, that's a very different question. That's a simpler equation. It has two questions. What are you willing to buy it for? And what are they willing to sell it for? And can you come to an agreement between those things? But as far as new construction, there is a floor on what new construction is ever going to cost or sell for or rent for. And that floor is determined by what does it cost to build. And it's not that different for nonprofit development. You take the profit out of the equation, but you still have to buy the land. You still have to build the building. You still have to finance the construction. And those things are subject to the same market forces that are driving up the price of all of those things. And in California, things are really out of hand in terms of the bare minimum cost of building affordable housing. This data is from the Government Accountability Office in, I believe, 2017. It is the median per unit development cost for new tax credit subsidized development in LA and San Francisco. You can see that it's above $350,000 per unit, which is obviously far more than the intended inhabitant would be able to pay for it. And here, this is from, these numbers are from UC Berkeley in 2019, and they break it down by 3 different regions in California. We have East Bay, South Bay, and Sacramento. And you can see that the land costs are high, but that all of the other things, construction cost is also tremendously high in California. This isn't true everywhere in the country, but one thing that has happened is that the price of land and housing are so out of hand in California that wages are inflated. There are all these sort of knock-on effects where the whole ecosystem around development, everything costs more. So historically, the answer for affordability for most people, if you don't win the lottery to get some sort of an income restricted home, the answer is used housing, which you can think of like a used car, because the theoretical floor on the cost of a used home is 0. In practice, it's nowhere near 0 unless you're somewhere like Detroit or Cleveland, in which case it actually might be. But if you think about who in your community, in just about any community, who lives in an affordable home in the literal sense of who lives in a home that they can afford without undue hardship. And most of those people are living in market rate housing that's old. And maybe they're making other accommodations. Maybe they're living with multiple roommates, or they're otherwise in some sort of a suboptimal situation. You see a lot of that. But that's what most lowercase a affordable housing is. You can think of the housing market like a giant game of musical chairs. And except that in musical chairs, the fastest person gets a chair. And in the housing market, the richest person gets a chair. And if you add new chairs to the game, maybe they're really nice chairs. Maybe they're big, cozy armchairs. The richest person gets it. And sure, they've freed up a chair for someone else. And that person has freed up a chair for someone else. And that filters its way on down. But that process doesn't necessarily provide a comfy chair to the poorest people playing this kind of cruel game, unless you have really a lot of chairs in the game. But I put this in here to point out that the number of chairs clearly matters. The overall housing supply, even market rate housing supply, clearly matters for this question. The places in the US where housing is broadly affordable are adding supply at a breakneck pace. There are places like Houston, Texas, and there are a whole bunch of problems created by that in its own right. It's just that affordability doesn't happen to be one of them. So just a little dose of realism on that question. The vacancy rate is really the mechanism through which how much housing is out there overall affects the price. Imagine you're a landlord, you've got a home for rent, and 50 people show up to your open house. Okay, I'm going to raise the rent a bit. I'm going to see what I can get. Oh, fewer people are still interested. Oh, now I have a taker. I have the highest bidder. The landlord has all the market power when there is scarcity. On the other hand, if you have high vacancy, if you have a lot of places to live and tenants have options, the landlord doesn't have the market power anymore. The tenant does. They can bid down the price. This is borne out in data. In multiple regions, what you see is that in years when the rental vacancy rate was higher, the median rents didn't change very much. And in years when the vacancy rate was low, rents went up. This is Minneapolis, St. Paul. Here's the same trend in the Seattle region. Years of high vacancy, you have very low to around 0 rent growth, and years of low vacancy, you have a lot of rent inflation. So really the issue here, like the economist's term would be that supply is inelastic. It's not, in terms of economics, sensitive to changes in price or income, but in plain English, able to encompass variety and change, flexible and adaptable. That's in a systemic sense, if we want housing to be consistently affordable to people across the income spectrum, the housing supply needs to be flexible and adaptable. One big problem with that in contemporary America is that there are really only two kinds of neighborhoods. There are neighborhoods getting a trickle of investment, a trickle of new development, and there are neighborhoods getting blasted with a fire hose of development. A small minority of places are expected to absorb nearly all of the brunt of growth and of new housing. And we have this binary choice, and neither choice is really appealing. And it also has huge consequences for affordability. What you see is large-scale developers look for a large-scale opportunity. They wait for an opportunity to buy up a whole block. You can see these boarded up houses here as the developer waits to erect something like what you see on the left. This is a really common dynamic in US cities. BuildZoom did a study of where new housing was built and what kind in the Los Angeles area since 1940. And I'm going to go through the time lapse here and then explain it a little bit. But on this map, light blue indicates single family homes. Orange and red indicate progressively bigger multifamily buildings. And then dark blue mean there is almost no construction in those areas. And as you go from 1940 to 1960 to 1980 to 2000, and finally to 2016, what you see is that the dark blue starts to take over. The Los Angeles area, much like Northern California, had a growth model that was predicated on an almost infinite supply of cheap land. And as long as we do that, we can apply our mass production model and we can just build more and more subdivisions out and out. And when that ceases to be possible, development gets squeezed into fewer and fewer areas, everything that's not the dark blue on this map. And in those areas, what you're doing with housing demand is think of a pot with boiling water in it, and the lid is on tight and it's really aggressively bubbling. And if you crack that lid in just one spot, you are going to get an intense rush of steam. If you channel all of the demand for new housing and all of the development into just a few neighborhoods, where it takes the form of huge condo buildings, the luxury condos that everyone loves to hate, you're going to get expensive development. You're going to get a lot of speculative activity bidding up the price. And you're going to get really disruptive impacts on those neighborhoods. And the speculation is going to distort land values beyond just the high-rise condo that goes up. Because now you're in a situation like this, where what if you're on the cusp of that hot neighborhood where all the developers are building? What's your land worth? I can tell you this vacant lot is not worth $200,000. Not to a speculator who sees which way things are moving. The housing market today tends to be an oligopoly. It tends to be a state of very limited competition with a small number of producers or sellers. You can think of an oligopoly like the broadband internet market, which in most cities in the US context, there's one or two, maybe if you're lucky, 3 or 4 providers, which means if you want internet at all, you have a choice between the devil on your left shoulder or the very similar terms offered by the devil on your right shoulder. And the housing market exhibits the characteristics of oligopoly. This has been studied by a team from the Johns Hopkins School of Business, where they find that fewer builders than ever are dominating local housing markets in America. In the typical market now, 90% of new housing is accounted for by 5 companies. And what that does is the same things that economists will tell you an oligopoly does in any industry. The price goes up. There's been an additional 3.1% annual increase in house prices beyond what otherwise you would have expected. And there's been a decrease in housing starts. There's less production. You can actually see the national trend here. This is data that I got from the St. Louis Fed, but total housing starts in the US fell off a cliff, as you might expect, in the 2008 crash. And it hasn't recovered since then. We have a system that isn't responding to the actual need for housing in the places where that need exists. It's responding to other things. It's responding to the imperatives of Wall Street and to the interests of a handful of corporations that dominate that market. Strong Towns proposes a 2-part response. And these parts depend on each other. One is that no neighborhood can be exempted from change. Every neighborhood needs to be open to some form of new housing, some next increment of development. If it's a place people want to live, people ought to be able to move in. And that might mean expanding the housing supply. That might mean replacing buildings with slightly larger buildings. You're going to have that evolution and change. And that's necessary for premise 2 to hold, which is not having the flood of investment, or what Jane Jacobs called cataclysmic money, into a handful of neighborhoods in the form of kind of over the top, out of scale luxury development. If you don't want that, you have to allow for something different, something more like what we saw in the past in US cities and in cities around the world. My friend Kevin Klinkenberg, who is an urban planner in Kansas City, calls this unleashing the swarm. If we got anybody with a bug phobia here, I apologize. It's meant to be a happy thing. Unleashing the swarm means unleashing the entrepreneurial energy and the efforts of a huge number of incremental developers doing small scale projects that fit in the context of their existing neighborhoods, many times more than the number of people who do that kind of work today. A study from Zillow 2 years ago found that if the Bay Area, if you simply took 1 out of 10 single family residences and you replaced it with a duplex, this is just a thought experiment here, the area's housing stock could grow just through that by 18.4% over 2 decades. Sorry, I had to look for what period they were talking about. Over 2 decades, and that's more than 200,000 homes beyond what the status quo would normally deliver. And that's just through replacing 1 out of 10 homes with a duplex, 1 or 2 per block. So the thought experiment, this isn't necessarily how it would pan out this evenly, but the idea is to illustrate the immense power of re-legalizing and paving the way for incremental development. For the kinds of efforts, home renovations, additions, backyard accessory dwelling units, small apartment or condo buildings, small live-work buildings, small scale, just all of these different things that people who aren't corporate developers, who aren't, completely professional capital D developers already do, but which there are a lot of obstacles that deter very many people from doing. I would argue that this is a desirable housing strategy, but that it's not happening very much now. We see very little of this kind of growth. We see a lot of that dark blue on the Southern California map, a lot of neighborhoods where nothing is being built at all. And so what needs to change that fact? I studied urban planning, so my particular expertise is not in the financial or the development side of things, but it's in the regulatory side, and I can speak to that. Land use regulation, a lot of people pay attention to the content of things like zoning. A lot fewer people pay attention to the effect of the process. As far as content goes, this is Somerville, Massachusetts, and Somerville is an old inner suburb of Boston, which really means that it's urban by US standards. Boston suburbs are older than most cities. And Somerville is all traditional urbanism of the kind we talked about, a lot of triple deckers, a mix of owners and renters. It's considered a very desirable place to live. It's quiet, it's quaint, people love it. The home values are high, the neighborhoods are stable. The only problem is that Somerville is illegal today. Everyone loves this place, but in all of Somerville, a zoning study found that there are 22, I don't know why my thing just went out of full screen mode. What? Is someone else controlling my screen? What is going on here? I apologize. I am momentary troubleshooting.
Good to know it happens to the big guys too.
I'm not really sure what happened, but let me go back there. A recent zoning study in Somerville, Massachusetts found that the city is overwhelmingly illegal to build today, that only 22 lots in all of Somerville, Massachusetts actually conform to the zoning code. And the reason for that is Somerville has been downzoned over time to prohibit multifamily development, no duplexes, no triplexes, no commercial and residential areas. A lot of this also has to do with things like parking requirements, where theoretically you could maybe fit more homes on the lot, but you couldn't fit the parking spaces that are mandatory for them. So we've made it illegal to build the kind of places that used to meet our housing needs. This is the zoned capacity of Los Angeles over the second half of the 20th century. Los Angeles used to have a massive amount of zoned capacity. In other words, units that were legal to build but hadn't been built. And almost all of it was lost to downzonings by 1990. So you have a regulatory freezing of the city in amber and saying we're not going to allow these neighborhoods to change. There is a movement against that now. There's a movement to re-legalize things like duplexes. This is the one my parents lived in when I was born. My aunt owned the house. My parents rented the unit upstairs as part of the deal. They got good rent. They got a lot of free childcare. It was a wonderful situation for us. It would not have been legal to build in that neighborhood. It existed as a non-conforming use in a single family zoned neighborhood. But it was a wonderful situation for our family and later for my aunt and her best friend who lived there for 30 years. Accessory dwelling units, backyard cottages on an existing lot. I've lived in 2 of them. These are pictures of them. Again, these are a way of meeting practical housing needs within existing neighborhoods, within that fabric, that are illegal far more places than they're legal. They fall into a broader category of what Opticos Design, a planning firm, has dubbed missing middle housing. The missing middle between a detached single family home and a large apartment building. And almost all of it is either literally illegal in most American neighborhoods, or it's functionally illegal because of things like setback requirements from the street, because of things like parking requirements. You can't build it. This is a shame for affordability because the missing middle is the cheapest kind of home you can build. And this graphic illustrates why. The construction cost per unit of a building with homes in it tends to increase in stair steps. As you add another story, you've got more costs, you've got more complexity. At a certain point above like 3 stories, now you have to have an elevator. Now you have to use different materials. So large apartment buildings are much more expensive to build per square foot or per apartment than single family homes or small buildings. The land cost, on the other hand, if you have really expensive land, as you do in Santa Cruz, the land cost is really prohibitive for affordable single family homes. You need to be able to divide that land cost across multiple households by building small multifamily. Well, the missing middle is the sweet spot. And where this is depends on a lot of very specific dynamics, but the sweet spot is where your land cost is as low as possible, but before the construction cost has started to jump because larger buildings are more expensive to build than small buildings. Not just more expensive, period, but more expensive per unit. The missing middle, things like fourplexes, things like small apartment buildings, is the absolute cheapest way to build housing, just in terms of the cost of building. The process makes it hard, even where the content of land use regulations doesn't. The processes that we use to regulate development have become intensely complicated. This is an abandoned parking lot in San Bruno where a large-scale apartment complex was proposed last year, I guess 2 years ago at this point. And the city put the developer through the ringer, and they said, ultimately, this was a report from the San Francisco Chronicle, the developer spent $3 million on the approval process, making all these additions, adding car and bike parking, community space, affordable units, and paying money into the city's general fund. This is the kind of negotiation that typically produces development these days. And the community often sees this as a good thing because, well, we're getting something out of the developer. We're giving the developer all this density and we're letting them massively change our community, and we want something back. Erica, I'm guessing I'm low on time here. I'm going to try to wrap up as quickly as I can.
Unfortunately, I have to say.
Yeah. I will skip a couple things and I will get to the end. This is a modified version of a 1-hour talk, so I'm doing my best here, and I apologize for the technical glitch. Anyway, it is very common these days for development to involve that kind of intense negotiation, to involve a complicated Byzantine set of rules. And that's a game that only the big developers know how to play, where they can absorb the cost of delay and uncertainty and the time involved in doing this. And that system tends to favor connected insiders. It tends to contribute to that oligopoly problem. And a lot of the existing models for getting affordable housing involve kind of skimming it off the top of that model. You've got the huge developer doing 500 luxury apartments, well, let's get 15% inclusionary as a requirement of this project. Let's get a dedication to such and such fund. That money goes to good use. But ultimately what it does is it makes it so the only development that happens is this big luxury development. How much of the new housing built in your community has to go through a public hearing? In most communities, the answer is most or all of it. And delay imposes all sorts of costs. And I'm not gonna, there's a lot of depth here that I'm gonna cut out for the sake of time. But studies have found that this is not an insignificant factor in increasing rents for housing that does exist, regulatory delays and regulatory complexity. In Austin, Texas, one study found $60 per month on top of the rent just from that factor. A study in Seattle found that it was as if the developer had to build an extra 9 apartments and then tear them down. This one building with affordable units in it went through the process for something like 8 years. What this does is it's a bigness bias, because the costs of complying with regulation, the costs of doing the public hearing, the costs of making all these concessions fall disproportionately on small projects. They are a much higher share of your total cost. And they squeeze out small projects. They squeeze out the missing middle. The last thing I had, and I don't know if you want me to go into it or stop here, was a couple examples of proposals very recently that have been successful in paving the way for more missing middle development and specifically focused on affordable development. I can do it in under 5 minutes, or I can wrap up here. I don't want to cut the discussion in the Q&A short. What would you like?
Well, go ahead and do it under 5 minutes. I think everybody agrees.
All right. Portland, so a number of cities and states have been pushing to broadly legalize missing middle development, or you might hear it framed as eliminate single family zoning. Portland is a really interesting model right now, because what they've done is they've not just legalized missing middle housing citywide up to 4 units. They make it up to 6 units if it's affordable, if it is income restricted and has an affordability requirement attached, 60% of area median income. And in exchange, they offer a density bonus for affordable development. The building can be a little bigger, it can be a little taller. There's sort of a sliding scale where you don't get that bonus if it's not affordable. And the result is that to create permanently affordable homes, here's that cost curve. When you build missing middle housing, you dramatically decrease the amount of subsidy required to do so. And Portland did this in cooperation. The planning department worked with nonprofit developers, including Habitat for Humanity, and small scale developers who were used to doing infill homes in Portland's neighborhoods, to sort of run their models through a practical test and say, okay, does the math work? Will people actually build this if this is what we allow? And they found that sliding scale size cap, which means if your housing is affordable, you get more density, you get fewer other requirements. That made all the difference in terms of making this something that's actually viable at scale. This is a brand new reform. It passed last fall, so we'll see what the results are. The other really exciting trend to me is accessory dwelling units. There's a lot of momentum around this, particularly on the West Coast, but throughout the country. And one of the big success stories right now is Los Angeles, where in 2018, accessory dwelling units accounted for 1/5 of all housing permits issued in all of Los Angeles. And the numbers continued to go up in 2019. There has just been an absolute explosion in homeowners building these backyard accessory units, or you can also do an attached accessory unit. The big thing that changed, as I understand it, was state law. There are probably people here who know more about this law and the details of it than I do. But it sort of limited the barriers that you could put up in your local ordinances, because a lot of those barriers are subtle. Simply saying ADUs are legal now, you can have one on your lot, doesn't necessarily mean it's a viable option for most people. You need to deal with things like parking requirements, setback requirements. Rules about owner occupancy can be really prohibitive for people. And then finally, there are some barriers involving things like financing. It is very difficult to finance an ADU if a bank won't give you a loan against your existing home equity to build it. And so you see places working on that aspect of it, addressing those barriers. Santa Cruz has done great work with design templates to remove some of the uncertainty around what can this look like and will it be approved if I do it. as I said, the state law in California overriding local barriers. And then companies are popping up, such as Dweller, which is in Portland, that essentially outsource a lot of the process of building the ADU, the parts that the homeowner who's really not a developer and never wanted to be, but wants an income generating rental property on their lot. Now they don't have to be a developer. They don't have to develop all of those skill sets in order to do this. So to me, these are ways of starting to thicken up our existing neighborhoods, starting to flatten out this fire hose dynamic, where instead of the big luxury building downtown and nothing in the rest of the city, we start to have a system that can organically produce housing where it's needed at a whole bunch of really small increments. Thank you. I've got a couple links on this last slide for the Strong Towns Academy. We have an online course that I am the primary lecturer on that is the much, much longer version of the talk I just gave. And we have several other courses that either exist or are in the works there as well.
Also, Daniel, you guys are doing a series of sessions called
the locomotive tour.
Yeah.
That's the other link on here. Yeah, we are over the course of this winter and spring. We're doing a series of 10 Thursday hands-on workshops. They're all webcasts, and they're with experts in areas ranging from transportation to tactical urbanism to housing to community organizing. And they're fun. They're great. All the information is at strongtowns.org/locomotive.
Okay. Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Before we continue, I wanted to apologize to the people that were waiting for the sessions to start and hearing our conversations trying to prepare for the session. That was very rude of us, and I didn't know it was happening, and I wasn't sure how to turn it off, but I will do better tomorrow. So please accept my apologies for that.
Great. Daniel, thank you. That was an incredible amount of food for thought. As a matter of fact, we're going to do some other questions here. So I thank all our panelists, and everyone, I think, must understand that housing is essential to all our lives. We need a place to sleep, to eat, for family and friends, a place of peace of mind, for mental and physical health, which is a major impetus for our conference today. So throwing out the first set of questions, I'm going to go to our panelists and have you reply to Daniel's presentation, because it was pretty extraordinary in my mind. So we can go in any order. I'll just look on my screen and I see Sandy Brown. We'll go with you, Sandy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad that we're doing it this way, because I've been writing down questions that I want to be able to ask the questions instead of trying to answer. So, I really appreciated, Daniel, I loved your presentation, and I get your, your ideas about, kind of changing the system and moving in a direction that allows dot housing to develop organically, or get built more organically than it has now. And I guess I wonder if, so we struggle in Santa Cruz with that dynamic that you have described, very, very much so. But the challenge that we face is so much about kind of the two poles that we appear to be kind of stuck in, right? So you can either be a YIMBY and say, build, build, build. We don't care, it'll be affordable by design, which I do not believe is really reality here, at least not in the short term, or we don't want anything built. But there are so many of us who actually are very concerned and interested in, these ideas that will get us to increased units, but without that displacement and gentrification that seems to just automatically go along with it in a community like Santa Cruz that is so desirable. It's so the supply demand, it's really, supply effective demand. And when you have an economic engine right next door, and kind of increasingly in our community that can pay, a much higher price, it doesn't matter if we build more. Necessarily, we just see people moving into those units who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be living in Santa Cruz. And when I say that, people say, well, you just want to shut the door and, not let other people in. And that's not, I think, what and I think I represent a lot of voices here, so I'm kind of putting it out there. How to address that question in a way that gets us to, there being some like a sense of potential to invest for smaller builders to invest, and to be able to do it in a way that is responsive to community. You started at the beginning with a comment about resilient and sustainable communities being communities that really respond to bottom-up influences and bottom-up input, and that doesn't seem to be the case here in Santa Cruz. So I'm kind of throwing some stuff out there. This is one of the things that I kind of constantly as a member of the city council struggle with, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what we do. I'm a big fan actually of regulating, and requiring inclusionary units. I don't think it's going to solve our problem, but given how limited our ability is to get more housing, even higher density housing, those are the only affordable units that ever get built in our community. So I'll just leave it there. I'd love to hear from you I guess I'll give everybody else a chance to respond, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Take some notes, Daniel. That'd be great. Candace, got you. You're up now. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was an amazing presentation, and there was so much about what he said that I see, unfortunately, in the most recent patterns in Santa Cruz. Just to give you some examples, I'm basically a community member. I've lived here for 47 years and started getting involved in land use issues about 6 or 7 years ago. Started looking at what was really going on because something had really shifted in our community. And whereas before, a lot of people did have.
Just slow down a little for our translator. She's take a deep
Thank you.
pause. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry, Ava.
Sorry, Ava.
I will try to go slower. How's that? So simply, there are a lot of examples I can give where the community really didn't benefit from the ability to provide this sort of middle housing, middle market housing. So that, for instance, somebody knew the Staff of Life, they wanted to take a single family home and build 3 condos. They said it wasn't dense enough. And so and in fact, their permits had expired within 6 months, and they asked for just a small extension of that permit that had already been approved, and they were denied. When I see other people that were offered 6 years extensions for very large projects. And so I asked myself, so this smaller developer did not have an opportunity to develop in Santa Cruz and gave up and sold the property. I can give another example of a family compound where they have 3 houses. They wanted to build a 4th house, and they were told, and this is a family compound, only family members, they were told they couldn't build that home because, again, it wasn't dense enough. The city had something else in mind, and so denied that property. So a lot of these little projects throughout the city that could happen are being denied, and people really don't know this is happening. It's been going on for a while. I know a situation where there was a duplex in an illegal garage. They sold it to somebody. They had 3 couples in there. The city started coming down on them in the legal garage, and the new owner just didn't want to deal with it. So sold the property. The person carrying the mortgage had to take a significant gain. Everybody lost out. The 3 couples are kicked out. So these are all examples of things that are happening in Santa Cruz. While at the same time downtown, when the downtown update plan.
I hate to interrupt. Can you about 30 seconds wrap it up?
When the downtown update plan happened, the big developers are told we're ready to develop. And all the big developers started buying up those properties, or already had bought up the property. And only I could put on 2 hands the significant developers in our community who we all know, and they were all in on that development before the rezoning had even happened. And so they will benefit, at the expense really of the broader community.
Thank you. Next is Rebecca Garcia.
Thank you, Daniel, for that great presentation. And the question that I'd like to answer that you posed was, how do we make housing affordable? And so in terms of Watsonville has not yet met its RENA affordable housing rate, but it is ahead of most of the other Santa Cruz County jurisdictions. We have in Watsonville 1,800 homes that are offered at below market rate, which says then that they are affordable housing. These include public housing managed by the Housing Authority, nonprofit housing development, working with nonprofits as Eden and Mid-Penn Housing. And we have project-based Section 8 housing also. So these homes provide housing for special need groups, such as persons with physical and mental disabilities, farm workers, and homeless persons. In addition, there's over 1,000 homes restricted to persons over the age of 55, our senior citizens housing, that are considered affordable by design. And how we made this happen was since 1992, we've had an inclusionary ordinance, which means that all housing developments are 15 to 20% affordable. And we've worked closely with the nonprofit development that I mentioned earlier, Mid-Penn Housing, Eden Housing, and even Habitat for Community. So we're dependent on this inclusionary ordinance and on our working and supporting those nonprofits to make our housing affordable. But we have a long ways to go because in Watsonville, we're only 6 square miles and most of our land is already taken. So we are going to have to do infill, which means we're going to have to go up and change many of our policy to allow that going up to happen. But affordable housing is happening in Watsonville, although we have more to do.
Thank you. Don, you got to mute, please.
Thanks. Thanks for the great talk. And I just want to also acknowledge that there's some people who are watching this that are really great, knowledgeable experts who aren't on our panel. And I hope we'll get some comments and questions from them too. It's great to see them participating. The thing that I just really want to zero in on just in this moment is some of the things going on in California that are already moving in a positive direction. And Daniel did touch on them, but I think it's really important to note all the legislation of the last couple of years that have created a lot more by right development so that it doesn't have to go through a tremendous long regulatory process. A lot of developments, there's new rules that basically say you cannot downzone in your community anymore. We're just not allowing that anymore. Once your general plan and zoning are in place, you can't squeeze, remove housing development opportunities from your framework. There's huge reforms in terms of accessory dwelling units, a lot more completely removing certain regulatory barriers that exist in the past, a whole new category of like junior ADUs that are even smaller and simpler for people to develop. Mentioned the bonus density, which again makes it possible for projects to pencil out, as we talked about earlier. So I don't want to say that these alone are the solution, but I do think that these really go at the kinds of things that Daniel talks about, of sort of changing the system so that we can actually get more housing developed. And it will take a long time to do these things, but they are a piece of the puzzle as we do some of the shorter term things that we'll probably be talking about later in terms of inclusionary units and publicly subsidized units that would be bring affordable housing right away, but in smaller quantities.
Thank you. Daniel, would you like to do a kind of a quick response to our panelists' questions and thoughts?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in yes and I hope that came through in the talk, that I think that it's important to do the things that work right now. And it's important to, like Don just said, applaud the progress that's already happening right now and not zero in on any one thing as like, this has to be the solution. And if you're not on board this particular train, then you're on the wrong team. I feel like, I don't know, I was living in San Francisco when the YIMBY NIMBY wars really started to escalate there. And I agree that it was a shame that people got really boxed into these incredibly hostile camps. Neither of which was really addressing the dimensions of the problem, and both of which, like, there was this incentive to be really fixated on, we only have so much political capital and we have to do my thing. So like inclusionary zoning, I was maybe a little critical of it in my talk, and the context in which I'd be critical of it is, I think what you've got to weigh is, are you trying to solve for how do we create affordable housing in ways that are dependent on perpetuating the bigger dysfunction in the system? So getting inclusionary units, like if they are the only way you are getting affordable units built right now, that's great. And if you're in an environment where development is so lucrative that it's happening even with the inclusionary requirement, that's great. And I think the question becomes, what effect is it having on deterring the other things further downstream that really need to happen? I'm a big fan of doing kind of not treating all development with the same brush, but you can apply a different level of scrutiny, a different level of requirements for inclusionary or set-asides or in lieu fees to large scale development, but do as much as you can to exempt the really small scale stuff from that, because of that issue where, as a percent of the project cost, complying with all these regulatory barriers, or simply even having to go through a development process that's not as of right, is so prohibitive for small scale development that it ends up killing a lot of it before it ever happens. And that's not the case for big projects. If someone is building 400 apartments downtown, absolutely put an inclusionary requirement on them. In California's market, that can support that.
Great, thank you. We have about 25 minutes for just our questions, and then we'll go to to our viewers. So the first one, our conference is affordable housing possible? And some people have already talked to it and alluded to it. So let's just go around, I think, if we could, real quickly, of what would be acceptable to try to do that, and who might be responsible for that. I'll go in reverse order. Don, would you like to try that one?
Sure. And I absolutely think it's possible. I mean, it's really, the only question is how much is possible. That may be where we're going to have the disagreement, because clearly it's possible if we have, for instance, more funding sources to subsidize affordable housing, we'll get more affordable housing than we're getting now. And that doesn't mean that that's the magic solution, but that's going to get us some. I think these the zoning and the regulatory changes that I was talking about earlier are very possible. I think it's important to think, I think there's so much interest in the ADU question, and clearly there's a lot more, there are a lot of ADUs, both legal and illegal in the city of Santa Cruz, at least, and there could be a lot more. And that those are possible, more possible than ever, because of both mainly state regulatory changes, but also the city has then facilitated some of those changes. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We have to, I think to me, the way, I think Daniel used the term, and I think it's so important right now, is the yes and. It's going to take a whole bunch of different things to be shifting in the right direction to make it possible. Another thing that's always on my mind is, what do we think regulatorily is an adequate place to live? We have gotten to the point now where our expectations, certainly in California, by standards of what makes a sort of legitimate, approvable unit, have gotten so high that it becomes very expensive to build that. And some people, frankly, who because of that are living, in a tent along the freeway, really don't they don't expect, the best, the highest quality construction in where they live. They just want a goddamn place to live. And so sometimes we have to think about that too. We have to think differently about what is an adequate place that we can build in our community that becomes an affordable home for someone.
Great. Rebecca.
Yes, I've already mentioned in terms of what Watsonville depends on an inclusionary ordinance and working with the nonprofit housing developers to provide affordable housing. But I agree with in terms of what we've done most recently is we have actually had an ADU ordinance for many years and recently approved updates to the ordinance to provide the opportunity for more affordable housing. And we're also developing an ADU loan program to assist homeowners in financing the development of ADUs. But in addition to that, we also have a couple of loan programs. It doesn't make the housing affordable, but it helps residents buy housing, affordable housing. And so we have like first-time home buyers loans that we give. We have loans for those that just qualify because they're low income. And so those are the methods we're using in Watsonville to provide more affordable housing and to support residents in buying affordable housing.
Thank you. Candace?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think, again, going to kind of what Sandy was alluding to, we have some unique situations. We are a university town, and yet the university depends on the town for housing. It's growing at such a rapid rate that it's quadrupled since I went to the university, and they want to add another 40% to it. So I think we really have to address student housing, which could be tailored to a higher density with shared resources and cohabitation areas. I think that would pull a lot of housing that could then be available for families. We also need to look at family housing, which is not happening right now with SOUs and studios. About 80 to 90% of housing now is only in the smaller categories. And those are very, very expensive, with the amenities of the bathrooms and kitchens and such, very dense and we also need to make sure that the developers are not let out of inclusionary housing through in lieu fees, as was the case with 555 Pacific, where they paid 1.4 million, I think 1.5 something with interest. And we need to ensure that inclusionary housing happens. 15-20%, frankly, isn't enough when we have poverty levels for almost 30% of our residents. And so we really need to focus on higher inclusionary and maintain that on every project, whether it's a recession or not, or at least make sure that when development happens, that it includes that.
Great, thank you. Sandy, I should say Santa Cruz does have 20% now. Is that inadequate?
Yeah.
Are you asking me?
Yeah, because you mentioned the inclusionary housing.
If you want to go for it, Candace, go for it. But I was going to speak
Sandy
to it.
can address that too, I guess. Sure.
Yeah. So is affordable housing possible? You know, I think the first part of my answer is where Dawn started. It is possible, and it depends on how much, right? How much can we get to? And what we know, at least from recent experience, the past several decades, is that the way we get it is through requiring it and much of the time deep subsidy. And so I think that we have, we are situated to, and we have, a city economic development department, planning and community development that has really been great on trying to find financing and, try to work with nonprofit affordable housing developers to make those projects happen. They haven't happened. Since the end of redevelopment, it's been even harder. I acknowledge all of that. But I think the way that we, if we really are serious about a meaningful contribution to getting affordable units built, we will actually we will continue to do what we've done with, for example, Pacific Station, South and North, use city-owned property, city-owned land to incentivize the production of affordable units. And higher densities make sense in many of those places. So, we have the potential to actually get access to funding. We have a project that has been proposed and approved that's going to be a significant number of affordable units and supportive housing units. But we also have developers telling us they can't do it. And so we actually, and I will just say, you know, we've had an inclusionary housing rule on the books. We have been letting developers out of it, not just through in lieu fees, but just out of it for years and years. And as a result of that, no affordable units have been built in private projects that I can think of, you know, Measure O, deed restricted affordable units in years. So this is a problem that requires, I think, addressing the incentive side and finding ways to, you know, and I think, Daniel, some of the points you've made are really well taken, but then to not bend over backwards and then to allow for the highest density development possible when it's high-end, you know, big developers doing it, and tell them they don't have to pay, you know, do their inclusionary housing, make commitments, and then tell smaller, you know, the story that Candace told. I've heard it many, many times. So, you know, and we have a 20% inclusionary housing rule now, which is going to get us, if we're lucky, if we can get a developer to agree to do it, to 15% if we're lucky, because the density bonus and inclusionary rules are not stacked. And we, I think we actually could pursue that angle. And so, but that's a longer conversation. So I think there are ways to, you know, to regulate it and incentivize it. But what we're doing now is not working. It's not even looking towards producing affordable units.
Okay.
And I know I went over time, but I just had to say all that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. Daniel, would you like to respond? Take a few minutes.
I mean, one question I would have about the level of the inclusionary requirements, and this is a technical question that I don't know the answer to, because it requires really looking at local development costs and market conditions. But there's a good amount of research that says you get much above like 18 or 20% in your inclusionary requirement, and you end up deterring development altogether because it's no longer profitable to do. And so now you're not getting the affordable units, and you're also not getting the market rate supply. And I think that question, I mean, this isn't about letting developers off the hook, but it's about consulting with trusted people who know the development finance side of it, can do the, you know how the pro forma works, and they aren't giving you their spin, but they're actually going to tell you this is the effect it's going to have on what pencils and what doesn't. And you don't necessarily see it in existing projects. You see it in projects that never happen. So that's the thing I'm wary about. Like, it's easy to say our set aside, our needs are higher, so our set aside should just go up and up and up and up. And there's a practical limit, and where you hit the limit is where projects just can't happen. I had something else that I made a note on, and I can't find that note. But I will have an opportunity.
You'll have another opportunity, that's for sure.
Ron, can I ask a question quickly, please?
Sure, Eric.
I wasn't going to, but I can't resist it. It sounds like the dynamic on the Watsonville City Council is different than the dynamic on the Santa Cruz City Council. Could Rebecca and Sandy please talk to that?
Well, I want to say, in terms of our inclusionary ordinance, as I said, we've had it since 1992, which is longer than any of the other city jurisdiction in actually the region. And at first, we started with 25% inclusionary ordinance. And we found, what Daniel pointed out, that nobody would come in to build at 25%. And so now we have 15% and 20%. The 15% is if you build under 8 units, and the 20% is 8 or above units. And quite frankly, we haven't had any problem in having developers come in under those conditions. And I don't know the reason why, but we are very fortunate that developers do come in and build.
Thank you. Sandy, you're muted.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I think that it's a long and a big conversation, and there are other differences in terms of the market and where the market has been historically, and land availability and all kinds of other things outside of the realm of the specific regulations around affordable housing getting built locally. We have had an inclusionary ordinance on the books in Santa Cruz since the 1980s after the voters passed Measure O. But what happened was, for many, many years, developers we're not required to meet it, and through a variety of mechanisms. And it's complicated, and many people will argue with me and say, oh no, they really are, but it really ultimately has not led to units getting built. So I think that what I've heard, and Rebecca, it sounds like your city council has been there, but I've talked with other council members who have said, well, we just said this is what we want and this is what we're going to do, and if developers come and say they can't do it, then a developer will come who says they can. And whereas I feel like in Santa Cruz, we just say to the developers, okay, we hear you, and we don't even wait to see if something will get built. We just say, okay, right? And so there's a political will issue there as well. And I think just one other thing I want to say, Daniel, to your point, your point is very well taken, but what we don't account for is the differences. I mean, we have projects that come to us and they say, we can't afford to build the units, and they own the land outright. There is no land cost. And then the ones who actually do have the land cost, well, okay, that makes a big difference, but we don't distinguish ever between them. And I think that is important too.
Great. Those that are listening in the chat is to talk among you guys. If you have questions for the panelists, please put them under the Q&A section. Okay, thank you. So as follow-up, some more questions. You guys have been great, very informative. So I'm going to say private financial institutions have done a rather poor job in getting affordable housing. Can this be changed? What role can public financial institutions, such as public banks, credit unions, or bonding measures play in getting affordable housing in Santa Cruz County? I'll just go randomly. I'll start with Candace.
It's not really my area of expertise, so maybe you can pass it to somebody else. But one thing I can say is that basically housing being built is determined by the financial market. So if you look at the lost decade, after the recession, and that was a time when they eliminated inclusionary, thinking that somehow that would have an effect. It had no effect because, frankly, other parameters are affecting whether housing is built because of the financial market.
Don, here's an area you try to measure H. Was it H, right? Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Ron. A couple of thoughts. One is, there is still a role in I just don't want to leave this out. Private banks and private financiers do help with some affordable projects because of the system of tax credit financing that's used in many affordable projects. Then it is the private financing market that does play a role there. And frankly, almost all nonprofit developers still use private financial institutions to finance their projects. So I'm not saying that they're doing enough, but in that particular space, they do have an actual role that's useful. But there, the answer I think is, and Sandy alluded to this. It's not just the money financing; it's the land. There's public land and land owned by nonprofit organizations. Churches, for instance, is a good example, who would essentially give their land if they knew that it was going to be affordable, capital A, affordable housing. And so that's a really important financing role that the non-private sector has, is thinking about what land resources are available. And then I do think, especially, I think it's a ways before we get there, but I think the idea of a state bank or public banks will really be a valuable tool in this, because obviously the investing that an institution like that makes is going to be for public goods, like affordable housing, and not just for profit investments. So I think that'll be really valuable. And then Ron, I know, really wanted, was kind of queuing me up for this, to just make sure we do say that it is really valuable for a local jurisdiction or local community to have its own revenue stream to help subsidize affordable housing, because that, part of it is just for the direct subsidy that we're able to contribute, but perhaps more importantly, an awful lot of state and federal funding flows more to communities that have some of their own money to put into these projects. Nonprofit affordable developments are always a patchwork of many funding sources. And if we can provide locally some of that money, we actually draw some of the other money from other sources. So there is a lot of potential there. I've been part of work to get us a local funding source, and I probably will be working on that in the future as well.
Great. Rebecca.
I'm like Candace. I don't have a lot of expertise and knowledge about financing, but I do know, as Dawn mentioned, in terms of the nonprofit housing developments, they have had no problems getting financing from private institutions. The only, in the last 2 years, I think it was, one of our developments was dependent on getting finances by China, but and so all their investors were from China. However, with Trump and China conflict, that money was pulled back, and so they ended up selling the land because of the lack of financing that originally was going to come from China. But all other developments that we've had, and we've had about 5 different developments in the last few years, they had no problems in terms of getting finances from private institutions.
Great. Sandy.
Candace, did you want to say something? I saw your hand up. No?
Nope.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that one thing I forgot to mention is that with the 2018 Job and Tax Cut Act of Trump's measures, they introduced the idea of opportunity zones, and this is something that a lot of people are not aware of, but it has caused, I think, some disparate speculation because it's only in certain areas of town. So it is going to cause major disruption to neighborhoods mostly east of the river in a couple particular zones. And that's why people are seeing major development. Developers are actually even coming from other parts of the country, or at least from Silicon Valley, and investing in those areas for very high dense speculative development. Not necessarily affordable though.
Sandy.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Just, well, ditto everything that Dawn said, and I think I just highlight, we really do need our own local dedicated funding stream. I think that's really important. I think it's something that those of us, there's a lot of people out there listening, and I think many of you have probably been involved in the past effort, and hopefully we'll have another effort like that to have some kind of dedicated revenue source for affordable housing to help with those matching requirements, et cetera. In terms of the role that the big banks make it very difficult, and I believe it when developers say, it's hard to get, financing for projects where the banks see high inclusionary figures or, other barriers. And that's not something we can change. With respect to I think the layer that Dawn was talking about with, the tax credits and, that layering that projects need and use to make it work. I think our Community Reinvestment Act has been gutted over the years, and there's a lot of work that could be done there. And it would need to happen, lobbying at the state level and, trying to get banks to be required to use a higher percentage of their money, their profits for community reinvestment purposes. So I'll just leave it there. And yeah, that's it, I think. Thanks.
Daniel, would you like to weigh in? You're muted.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I would second a lot of what Don said. I love the idea of local communities really looking at their land as a resource and thinking seriously about how can we put that to the best public purpose. And I'm not an expert on the nitty gritty of the local financing. I mean, I am aware of some of the ways that affordable housing finance tends to be a patchwork, and it seems like it's really important to have a reliable local funding stream to leverage outside funding, so, to leverage federal dollars to provide the gap financing for things like a tax credit project. But I think also looking at solutions that maybe haven't been tried as much, like if in conjunction with a policy to encourage ADUs, what about here's a grant if you make your ADU affordable, if you accept Section 8, if you do this, you do that. I think the question is, developing housing is expensive and it doesn't scale very well. So how do you put public sector resources to uses that will scale, and getting creative with that?
Great. Okay, we're gonna move on. I'm gonna give 10 more minutes to these questions, and I'll go through the Q&As. And
Hey, Ron, can I add just one thing while you're looking at your question? On the ADUs, I did somebody helped me gather this information, which was great. Since 1986, we were one of the first in the state to have very progressive ADU policies. And as a result, citizens have basically provided housing up to 524 units. And this is quite up to date up through January 2021, of which 47 are listed as affordable, which means for perpetuity. And they found in general that the rents are about half what they are, and they're twice the size. So the average ADU is about 600 square feet, 1,000 to 1,800 in price, whereas the units that are now being built that are considered affordable by design are 300 to 400 square feet and are 1,800 to 2,000, are starting at that level. And so they're smaller and considered unaffordable.
great. So the last two questions, throwing out there's so much to talk about. For any panelists that would like to talk to this one, what part could rent control play in increasing affordable housing? Let's start with Sandy.
Well, this is a really long conversation too. I'll just be short and say, rent control isn't going to create affordable housing. Rent control is intended to stabilize rents, to stabilize, communities as a result of that rent stabilization. And I think it can play a role, unfortunately, without some additional rules around just cause eviction, which seem to not be very popular with our voters the last time around. It's not really going to do very much. But I believe that a strong rent control policy with just cause rules could provide that stability. Again, it's not going to make housing more affordable. It's just going to make it less bad, more expensive, right? So. But I think also that, the state, I would love to see the state take this on in a more, thoughtful and, deeper way as well, to make it really work.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to have something to say on this one? I see Rebecca.
Yeah, I agree with what Sandy just shared. About 3 years ago, maybe it was 4 years ago, I had staff do some research in terms of rent control for Watsonville. And what we found out that in terms of those that could take advantage of it, most of our housing are actually renter housing, and they did not meet the criteria. And maybe one of you can remember the name of the legislation that exists right now that gives all sorts of requirements in terms of which units can fall under rent control. But less than 40% of our housing units qualified for rent control. And so I made a determination that the cost of running a campaign for rent control is not worthy in terms of trying to get rent control passed in Watsonville. So I let it go.
Great. Anyone else? I'm going to go to Daniel if no one else. Donna?
I was just going to I think Rebecca was asking that legislation, the Costa-Hawkins law is what limits what cities can do with rent control. The thing that I'd say is that, I think we just, this is an argument that will just go on forever. I think when there is rent control, it does make housing for a lot of people more affordable than it would be if it wasn't there. And at the same time, it is probably true that there is some loss of housing stock, one way or the whether it's through people taking it off the market or through a lack of new building going on, that causes, you know, a different pressure on the housing market. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag, and everyone has their own view about which is the bigger push. But I think it is valuable that we have some regulation of rents in a place where we have, you know, it's just classic, you know, economics 101, you know, that if you're going to limit the supply of housing, which is what we historically have done, it makes sense to then to also have some cost controls on it, because otherwise the law of supply and demand means that limited supply and more demand, we're just going to have the price go up and up and up. And that's the history of rental housing in California and lots of other places. So as long as we have this limited supply, it is good, I think, that there's some restraint on the rents.
Did you want to take a shot at this one, Daniel, or the discussion's good enough?
I don't have a whole lot to add, especially with the specifics like Costa-Hawkins that other people here aren't more knowledgeable about. I agree that rent control is a policy to stop the bleeding, essentially. You know, it's an emergency. You're in a situation where I think it can be warranted, and I'm not going to sit here and say absolutely no rent control because it distorts the market, but it has side effects. It's a Band-Aid. It's not a cure. It doesn't ultimately solve the supply problem. It doesn't ultimately produce more housing. It probably results in less.
I wish we had another hour. Erica, do you have a question you'd like to ask the panelists in the audience?
I wanted to, we have a ton of questions coming up with Q&A that are absolutely fascinating. And I was wondering if the panelists and Daniel and Eva might have a bit more time to say past 6 o'clock and then ask the audience if that's something they would like to do to cover more of the questions. If not, we'll stop at 6 and reconvene tomorrow for the second part of this. But yep, there's some amazing questions here, and you know, we decided on 2 sessions of 2 hours because it's difficult brain-wise to take more of that on, but clearly there are hours and hours and hours of discussions on
Right.
this topic to find a solution. So are the panelists able to stay a little bit later? Raise your hand if you can. If I get a bio break, I could do it, but otherwise.
Okay, wonderful. Is your hand up, Don? I couldn't see.
I was saying maybe an extra 15 minutes I could do.
Okay, that would be the maximum. That would be
So,
great.
Ron, are you ready to go to the audience questions? Because if you are, I propose a quick 3 to 5 minute break.
I was going to ask this last one, if everyone could
Okay,
just
sorry, go ahead.
take a 1 minute stab at it. Student housing, worker housing, family housing, housing for homeless. Short of having housing as a right, or maybe not, what are the institutional changes needed in order to provide housing for everyone that's affordable? So in your vision, looking ahead 20 years, what would you like it to look like? What do we need to do starting now to achieve those goals? Let's start with, who wants to go? Rebecca.
You know what, when I saw that question was coming, I said, oh my God, because I don't really have an answer in terms of 20 years. So many things happen just in 5 years. The hope, of course, is that all those that you mentioned, you know, the homeless, the disabled, the students, that they all have, they have a right to be in a safe home. But how we're going to make that happen in Santa Cruz County, and I think one of the questions you had considered is how can all the jurisdictions, the 4 cities and the county work together to make it happen? And so I think there should be a roundtable of all those entities, jurisdictions coming together and having that conversation to see what it is that together we might be able to do to provide that affordable housing that is needed here in Santa Cruz County.
Mm-hmm. Don, like to take a shot at this one?
Sure. You know, I think it's kind of the thing in the shorter term thing that I will mention is that I think it's kind of we have to start with a sort of a mindset change about like thinking about, well, what is housing? You know, sometimes I think we tend to think of, many people think of it as buildings and not as homes for humans who are part of our community. And when we get more into that mindset, I think can do more. And then if you take it even a step further, it's it's not just homes for people. For some people, it's their fundamental health. You know, for people who are living outside or are precariously housed, the fact that they're in that situation rather than being in stable housing means that their life and their health are really in trouble. And so if we think about how crucial that is, you know, in terms of, you know, just this fundamental need, human need, whether you call it a right or not is less important to me than just kind of a mindset of this is just essential for our well-being, both individually and as a community. The last point, just on the longer term, my vision is that we would have a lot more affordable rental housing with not very high amenities. And I know that sounds weird, but I think we need to really think about a lot more units that are really just to make sure people have a place to live and not necessarily that they have a really nice place to live.
Candace.
Yeah, to Don's point, I would agree with that. And I think that, you know, like student housing, there's some amazing high density housing that you can do. You know, for different kinds of workers, there might be different kinds of housing. The Fair Housing Act, you know, prevents discrimination in many areas, and it doesn't allow for preferences. So it's very challenging sometimes, but we have very particular needs in our community. It's very hard to target the housing development into those particular needs. But I would say that there also is a need to have housing where people work, and we haven't been very successful at that. And so, you know, although there's been a focus on the corridors and taking away small businesses, disrupting the neighborhoods mostly on the east side, I think that you could look at areas such as Harvey West or Delaware, where there's commercial zones that may not have been developed. There's 50 acres of land, or in Harvey West, where there's, you know, a lot of land basically, because it's a lot of parking lot areas where you could do major development. Or you could encourage small business or larger businesses such as Starbucks, where there's a, you know, 1.5 story building that could have been a 5 or 6 story building, but you know, that they didn't work it out so that they could actually create housing on top of the Starbucks at Ocean and Water. So there are areas where you could put housing that would make sense, and yet it's trying to bring the right people together to make that happen. And I think we can be a little bit more creative than we have been in the past.
Thank you. So you got Sandy. I think you're our last one for this question.
Okay, I'm not so much a visionary, but I'm going to use my time to talk about a few things that I think would be tremendously productive in getting us towards our goal of affordable housing for all. And none of them would in and of themselves be a solution, but together I think they could make a serious dent. So first, community housing land trust, partnering with a community housing land trust to develop affordable housing on some of the city properties, that smaller parcels that we've been told are not really amenable to affordable housing, can't get the economy of scale, but I think there's possibility there. Using our public land, not just aggressively using the city land we have available, but also going to the state and get surplus land dedicated to the city or to local jurisdictions that will use it for affordable housing, a dedicated revenue source. And then I think, you know, something that I've been thinking about and just haven't had a chance to say, we need to find mechanisms. I believe that we can and should find mechanisms to make property speculation less attractive in our community. Things like vacancy tax, potentially, you know, other speculation taxes. I just walked a lot of for this election, and I was stunned. Every multi-unit complex that I visited had many vacant units, with like one exception. There are huge numbers of apartments sitting empty. When we say we don't have housing, we do. It's, you know, it's just there are property managers in these big complexes who know that they can sit on them until the market recovers, because we lost a lot of residents due to COVID. So we need to do something about that. There's a bunch of housing sitting empty right now, and we're just not even talking about it. So I'll leave it there. But you know, whatever tools we have to kind of get at that speculative aspect of our market that's causing so much, I think really.
Everybody ready? We're going to just run through the Q&A. Please, if you're in the chat column, put it in the Q&A. Reggie is asking, given that ADUs are the cheapest kinds of homes to build, it seems like it would be reasonable to force them to accept price regulations, like being project-based, Section 8, deed restricted affordable housing. Who would like to speak to that one? Just put your hand up. Anybody able to? Kansas? And then Daniel. You're muted, Candace.
Candace?
Yeah, no, I think in my neighborhood, ADUs are a big part of the community and should be encouraged, but the city does impose quite a few burdens on the individual homeowners that make it very difficult. Every time you do a project, they say you got to add a sidewalk that could add another 20, 30, 50,000 in some cases. These burdens are just excessive. And also, if you want to, you know, bring it up to code and existing structure, it could add another 50 to 100,000. So these are huge costs for a single landowner, and I think need to be considered.
Mhm.
Health and safety is important, but the code is a different issue.
If no one else, I'll go to the next question. Don?
Right.
Daniel?
Yeah, I do think that there's a value in trying to I think this is probably a place for incentive about the things that Reggie's bringing up, that if the ADU property owner, homeowner, you know, gets some kind of special benefit like a loan or a grant to do this, I certainly think, and it's generally the case, then they would be required to have an affordability or rent restriction on it. However, again, the way the state law is now, there's an awful lot of leeway that homeowners have now to proceed with an ADU, and the city doesn't have the authority to essentially stop them. They can do things like what Candace said, you know, where there's still building requirements and so forth, but there's a lot fewer discretionary approvals associated with ADUs now. So it would really be more based on an incentive, I think.
Okay, anyone else? If not, I'll go to the next question from an anonymous attendee. What about the idea of using police funds to purchase old hotels and motels, converting them into 100% permanently affordable low-income housing, as was done recently in Austin, Texas? Is anyone able to speak to this question? Bet you Daniel could.
I've seen this done actually in Sarasota, Florida, where I live, remarkably effectively. I don't know what obstacles might exist sort of in the local context or how much potential there is with sites like this, but certainly I've seen that model here. And I find it creative and effective as far as it goes. Again, it only scales up as far as there are numbers of such properties, but you're dealing with a building that's already been built, and construction is the biggest cost problem you've got. So,
What is the con to that? Why wouldn't we do that?
I kind of agree. I don't think there's a lot of downside as long as they tend to be the underutilized units. I think perhaps could potentially be some downside in that motel rooms are built, you know, without some of the things that people want to have in their apartment, if you will. There's often nothing even close to a kitchen situation in there. So I think that's probably, it's just there's going to be some extra cost to convert them. But in the end, you know, if they're being underutilized, that's a really good plan. And there is money from the state right now to do that, especially associated with homelessness housing. Project Home Key, it's called.
Actually, in Watsonville, we have a hotel and an inn that is completely affordable in terms of the hotel on Main Street. Actually, the Housing Authority manages it, and it is just for veterans, homeless, and disabled. And then on West Beach, we have an inn where actually, oh, I forgot, it's a high percentage, but a high percentage of those that live there are Section 8 members. So in Wattsville, we have used those, but it's not taking from police funds. It's different type of funding. It's private funding and then funding through the Housing Authority.
I'll just say really quickly, I don't see any downside. What's preventing us is a political will. We need a majority of members of our elected body to be willing to explore this, and right now we don't have that.
All right, next question, pretty technical here. Our environment is from Ellen. Are environmental reviews required in California with SB 35? Can anyone speak to that? I guess not. Sorry, Ellen.
Oh, it depends on the project.
Right.
It depends on the project.
Okay, what is SB 35?
Density bonus.
Oh,
Well, if they follow prevailing wage, then all they have to do is get a building permit. They can bypass the EIR process.
mhm.
And we have provided those density bonus to two nonprofit affordable housing developments. And so we have made use of that legislation.
It's problematic though, again, in Santa Cruz, because very large, dense projects do have very significant impacts, especially in areas that there's not already high density housing and there's not accommodation of the infrastructure. And so to bypass that process, I think is going down a very challenging route for Santa Cruz.
All right, next question from Vivian. How can our government officials, Santa Cruz in particular, promote duplexes being built in neighborhoods? That would be a great plan and I'd jump on it. Anyone want to try that?
As opposed to 5-story buildings and single-story neighborhoods.
Duplexes, relative.
That's what she means though, right? So
I assume so. I'm just reading the question.
Oh,
Let's see, Don and then Daniel.
yeah, I was going to say, I think I don't want to downplay the premise of the question that government officials have a role in that, but it's really the neighborhoods that are the key. Are people in neighborhoods going to support that? And I think there's tremendous benefit to it. I would support it, especially in the context of remembering that ADUs are allowed pretty much throughout the community in single family neighborhoods. Why not allow a duplex? It's really not, that's really not substantially different. And in terms of impact, it means 2 households instead of 1. So I hope that would be agreeable. But again, if neighborhood groups and individuals in single family neighborhoods object, that is an obstacle for the elected officials to overcome.
I don't think there's really that much opposition as you might think. There's many illegal units in our town. There's thousands of them. I think it's more the matter of the enforcement of them being illegal that is the problem right now, rather than the acceptance of, like a duplex kind of, they might call it something else. It might be converted garage or a small cottage unit, whatever, but it goes under different names, but essentially it's 2 units on the property.
I think that's a really kind of profound point there that's underappreciated. I've seen that phenomenon even in a lot of inner ring suburbs around the country. There's one in particular I know of outside of Minneapolis that is full of essentially like stealth triplexes. And what they are is larger single family homes inhabited by multi-generational families sharing the space. And often kind of awkwardly because the house isn't really designed for it. And with a little bit of modification, it could, if you would legalize actually doing it as a legal triplex, as opposed to we're just going to cram all these people in here because that's how we can afford rent. But I think the political feasibility is one question. The one thing I wanted to offer is sort of a cautionary tale. Minneapolis is my hometown, and they made national headlines for legalizing up to 3 units on every residential lot citywide at the end of 2018. And since then, there have only been a trickle of permits pulled for that kind of development. In all of 2020, there were 3. And the reason comes down to the other requirements that still apply. And the biggest one in Minneapolis's case turns out to be floor area ratio, that there's a requirement that you can only have 0.5 FAR on what are these really small single family lots in the city. And what that amounts to is if you were to build a triplex, each unit would have to be something like 700 square feet. They're not, at that point, you're ruling a lot of families out of the market for it. Like there are practical obstacles that if you talk to any small scale developer who does this work, they'll say, well, this is why people aren't doing it. And it's not accounted for in the zoning codes. So the kind of big picture abstract lesson that I would say is the way you get this kind of thing at scale, not just allowed, but actually people doing it, is maximum flexibility. Not just in terms of what does the zoning allow in terms of use, but look at things like setbacks, look at things like minimum lot size, parking requirements. The whole package needs to be part of it. And do what Portland did and work with developers who know the math of doing this kind of thing and say, what would it take to make this an appealing prospect for hundreds of people and not a handful?
Anyone else want to address this? We'll go to the next question. If not, Rebecca.
I want to say that, I think that in terms of building, I think that neighbors maybe, but it is really more about individual, the willingness and ability to pay for that kind of construction on a single family lot. But because Candace brought it up, I just want to say we need to look at our rental inspection program. It is a huge deterrent to getting some of those units back on the market that have been constructed that really without too much cost could be made, could be regularized.
I've been told this could be up to 2,000 units. 500 to 2,000 units is a lot. Yeah.
We've already lost a lot of, anyone know that number? How many we've lost in terms of?
We've lost hundreds, and some people say it could be up to 2,000. I mean, 2,000 that, are illegal. Not all have been pulled off the market, but there've been hundreds pulled off the market.
Mm-hmm.
The official number is somewhere in the 500s, but based on just anecdotal, it's a lot more than that.
It's a lot more, believe me.
Mm-hmm.
Even in my neighborhood.
Next question from an anonymous attendee. It seems like Santa Cruz is still leaning heavily in favor of large developers when it comes to approving projects and applying those new regulations that Don Lane mentioned. Anyone want to speak to that in terms of large developers that seem to be building the majority of our projects in Santa Cruz? I don't know if Rebecca has a different view what's going on in Watsonville.
Well, actually, we have had, I don't know what's being defined as large developers, but we've had developers up to 150 units in a development, but another development that is less as 5 townhouses. So we have had a variety of developments in Watsonville, but like I said, I don't know what they're referring to in terms of their question, but from 150 to 5.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Don, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a little unsure what, there's a lot of language here that maybe is imprecise about what a large developer is, because does that mean corporate large or just the size of the development? Because there have been a fair number of nonprofits getting things approved lately also, but they are intending to be larger. And I think that part of that is, we're back to sort of the market and the realities of kind of building, is that there's an economy of scale that, just makes it, again, in the current regulatory environment, and the financing environment that, who can get financing, that's what kind of can make it through the system. And so I don't think that's just a Santa Cruz problem. I'm not saying there isn't a Santa Cruz aspect to it that may exacerbate it, but there's a lot of places where, it's a bigger developer that has the resources to move projects forward that actually gets it through the system. And it's very challenging for a small developer in almost any community that has significant regulations.
All right. If no one else, we'll go to the next question. It's from Sibley. There's no longer any additional parking requirements for ADUs, for example, because state law changed that. Most permit fees are eliminated. I don't know the question, but statement of fact. Anybody want to comment on that? If not, I will go to.
Well, I think there's other impositions though by the, at least maybe they've changed that, but I just know that there's added costs. You have to maybe upgrade your sewer line, or you have to like put in sidewalks. In our case, we have sidewalks and alleys. And if you have to add to both of those, it really adds to the cost.
You answered another person's question. Prohibitive costs of a sidewalk or an ADU. Now I'm going to Jillian's question. I attended a Zoom conference this morning on displacement, the Achilles heel of smart growth. After a decade of higher density in many cities in California, displacement of lower income residents followed by gentrification is a reality. I would appreciate this issue being addressed. Just put your hand up if you would like to speak to this.
Can you repeat the question?
After a decade of higher density in many cities in California, displacement of lower income residents, followed by gentrification, is a reality. I would appreciate this issue being addressed. That's considered the Achilles heel of smart growth.
Yeah.
I see Daniel's hand up.
I don't want to speak too much here. I would speak to that in that I think I wonder if that's not conflating a couple of things that are worth considering separately. Where a lot of the displacement question comes down to where are you seeing intense amounts of redevelopment? And often it's the communities that lack political clout to resist it. And so I think there's that fundamental dynamic where, and I talked in my presentation about the trickle and the fire hose dynamic, where you really do see massive increases in density funneled into very small areas. And to the extent that those are neighborhoods inhabited by lower income people, by people of color, yeah, you're going to see displacement sort of turbocharged by that. I don't think density is the cause of it. And I don't think density is the cause of the gentrification. And what you can actually observe, San Francisco is a really clear example of this. Neighborhoods that haven't seen any new development of consequence in the last few decades have gentrified just as much as those that have seen huge amounts of it. Haight-Ashbury has become incredibly unaffordable without a lot of large scale development. It's become affordable because people are moving in whether you build or not. The high-rise development tends to be a lagging indicator of gentrification. There has to already be enough market interest for those huge scale, hugely profitable developments to happen. So the displacement question is a huge one, and it's an urgent one. And I think it's about who has power and who gets to insulate themselves from the effects of development, not about a question of density or development form or style.
Don.
Yeah, I'm very focused on downtown as the opportunity in Santa Cruz for some of the smartest growth and the highest density development. And pretty much where I think we see all the opportunities for development, there really isn't any housing there now that's being kind of wiped away to, like that low quality housing be replaced with high quality. We're actually building just new housing, both, and some is market rate, but an awful lot of what's in the pipeline now is genuinely affordable too. And I don't think either of those is going to have any negative impact on kind of the lower income people who already live in Santa Cruz. And I think if anything, it will have a beneficial impact because there'll be at least a few hundred more units of rent restricted affordable housing.
Okay.
Can I say a word?
Sure.
So downtown, I think we've really, there's been some really poor planning there, to be quite honest, because I cannot imagine what the thinking was to put luxury condos right next to the metro. Are those people really going to be using public transportation when most of them, the architects themselves said this is for Silicon Valley commuters? That is not sustainable development. It's not smart growth. It's, and so we need to really state that clearly. Also, all of this market rate housing right now is driving up the AMI charts. We're seeing affordable housing, existing affordable housing rents going up 10% in the last 2 years, and that's a very serious trend. So I think we have to really look at some of these things and really think seriously about what we're doing. And also along the corridors, again, we don't have transit-oriented development. We don't have Caltrans, we don't have BART, we don't have light rail. We don't have the kind of transportation amenities. And when we do, the upzoning causes housing increase, and it has effects in other ways to the neighborhood. When you go from 10 units per acre to 150 to 200 units per acre, as is happening on water and ocean, significant disruption. I would also encourage people to look at urban displacement. I think it's .org. It's from UC Berkeley, Karen Chappell. She does a whole map and it shows the advanced gentrification going on in the last 5 years in Santa Cruz. Take a look.
Great, thank you. We have 10 minutes left and we're halfway through the questions, so we're not going to make it all. So I will ask the panelists if they would like to try to type them in later to answer them. You can have access to, or please attend tomorrow and you can ask the questions again. Sandy, do you have some?
I was just going to say, oh, first, I'm sorry, I do have to sign off. I have another meeting and I'm late now. But if somebody will save the Q&A and we have a way to reach people, I'd be happy to go through afterwards and try to send answers. So if there's a way to connect us after the fact, I'm happy to participate.
Thank you. I'll do that.
Thank you, Sandy.
And sorry, I got to go.
Bye. Okay, our next question is from Mike. How are we going to supply an adequate amount of water to the additional demands? I assume housing demands, especially considering UCSC enrollment and expansion, which raises a fundamental question of environmental impacts of allowing more dense, higher developments, the issue of carrying capacity in the environmental world. Who would like to speak to that? Candace.
So our general plan called out for, I think it was 31, no, it's 20, let's see, 21, 2,350 multifamily units and 800 single family homes up to 2030. Our water advisory committee mapped their water planning to that number. Anything beyond that, and even in very serious drought areas, even with that, we can't sustain ourselves in our community with our own water supply because we're not tied to the aqueduct. We just handle, the watershed and the surface water. So with that being said, I think at some point we really need to look at this, although, they are working seriously at future water sourcing, but water security is not in our future in the next 5 to 7, 10 years. We're rehabbing our existing infrastructure right now.
Anyone else? Don?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I think I'll use the university as the easiest example, but I think there's examples in the community as well that the university has managed, because like so many of us, they've retrofitted, they've changed habits, and they're actually, as they've grown, they're using actually less water. And in the same way, a lot of new development is so much more water efficient than the old, than old things that are in place. So it's not like, oh, automatically I'm saying there's going to be plenty of water, but I think it's important to recognize that a lot of new development in the current era has taken place without any increase in water demand. And I think we should at least not assume that we're going to run out of water because we have more housing. I mean, I think it's intuitive. One thing is that, multifamily buildings replacing, for instance, some single family homes, not that that's happening a lot here, but there's pretty much a huge reduction in external watering, for instance, in that kind of situation. So you actually end up with more people using the same amount of water. So it's just important to really do the math on it and not just assume.
I would have to really dispute that. When you have maybe 3 single-family homes and 150 units, you're saying that the water use will be less. I think that's an absurd statement, actually. I think.
And where did you, but you also just said it was 150 units, and I never said it was 150 units. I said it might be, it might be 10
right now.
Well,
It might be 10, but it's still far. It's not. You really have to look at the numbers. I would really dispute that.
Yeah, we do agree on that. We do need to look at the actual numbers.
Okay, we'll move on. Next question, Andrew. And with a growing tech sector, is there an effort to get tech giants to include Santa Cruz in their affordable housing commitments as they've made in Santa Clara County? Is anyone able to speak to that? Guess not. All right.
Andrew, I would ask that question tomorrow because you'll have people, I think, that can speak to that more readily tomorrow.
Yeah, and for John too, the question of AMBAG, I think would be more appropriate tomorrow night. So I'll go to Jan. How has the underfunding of HUD that's the Housing and Urban Development, contribute to the dearth of low-income housing? I think that also would be best for tomorrow night. We'll go to the next. Anonymous attendee. Would agreed upon design elements compatible with neighborhoods streamline the approval process and reduce the cost of developing low-income housing? Don.
I would say yes, and that is really what I hope is coming for Santa Cruz, is that there will be that kind of agreement on standards so that everybody knows what to expect, and then there won't be as much time taken fighting it out over how everything is designed. And it does say, time is money in housing development. So every time a process takes a lot longer and causes changes to a project, a lot of money is expended, and that makes it less affordable. So I think that's a really desirable thing to try to get to.
No one else? I'll go to the next anonymous attendee. Does anyone have experience with tenants unions? How effective are they in ensuring tenants know their rights? And these rights are protected, and I guess that's in terms of affordability of rent and rent increases and of that nature. Anyone able to speak to that?
I don't know anything about tenants unions, but I know in Watsonville, many of our renters get information and support from the city itself, from a housing manager, has an enormous amount of information and tenant rights that he informs renters. And we also have CRLA and the Watsonville Law Center that also works with many tenants in terms of informing them of their rights.
Anybody else? Okay. Next question would be from Andrea. I would like to hear some ideas about first steps to make community members feel like they're not racing against the clock with developers who will always be one step ahead of them when submitting plans, working with regulations, etc., and have all the funding and seemingly the friendly ear of the city of Santa Cruz. That might be true in Watsonville too, if you would like to speak to that.
Candace?
I wasn't sure. Was that a question or a statement?
Yeah,
It was kind of, it was said as a statement, but if you want to try to
she's looking
parse
for,
that out. I see Don's hand up. Did you have something, Candace? Okay, I'll go to Don.
I'll say one thing which, since, that really came into being after I departed from the city council, and I really want to give kudos to the city and city council for making this shift, is there are now required these earlier meetings when a substantial development is proposed. It doesn't mean that the developer, I'm not saying they don't have, they're not in the driver's seat, but it means that it's daylighted to the community much earlier than it used to be when there's these significant proposals, and the public meeting requirement associated with it, so that people can, give input earlier on to these kind of projects. So I think that's a step. I'm not saying that that solves everything, but that's not always been the case. And I think it's a valuable new step.
All right.
Yeah,
Somebody-
and I think just to add to that, 708 Water Street was a wonderful example of affordable housing. It's 41 units, 20% is for developmentally disabled, and otherwise it's very low income. It's a beautiful project. And there were 3 community meetings. The first was very contentious. The design looked like a prison. It was 5 stories. It would ruin the view shed from Branciforte. They took a lot of input, and we suggested different designs that were mission or Spanish-like in nature, with tar roofs, you know, sort of hiding all the mechanical elements and not ruin the view shed. Also considering parking requirements a little bit differently. And what we ended up with is that project. They took all our recommendations pretty much. It was really amazing, and I think in the end it was a much better project.
Great. I would love to keep asking more. I hope you'll be able to answer people's questions. Like I say, we're barely over half, and we're at 6:15 to respect everybody's time and evening. And I think Erica wants to have a few closing words with all of us. You guys
Well,
were awesome. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ron. I wanted to thank Daniel for being here tonight. And Rebecca, Candace, and Don, that's an invaluable, incredibly big gift of your time to us, with your expertise and everything you could tell us today. It was a great session, I think. We reconvene tomorrow at 4 o'clock. The 3 people who had questions, John, Andrew, and Jan, I have your questions. I'll put them first in the Q&A for tomorrow, so you'll have your questions answered tomorrow. And I think that's all I need to say. Thank you very much for being here today, the audience, and all of you in the panel, and can't wait to see you tomorrow again.